So today we want to talk about race and solidarity. And this is a conversation that has been ongoing in our media, amongst our politicians, and in our churches and our homes. So as a ministry, we wanted to talk about it because it matters and God has a lot to say about it. So I have with me today Dusty Frizzell, pastor and Chiefs fan extraordinaire, and Jeff Cravens, worship pastor and CrossFitter extraordinaire. And I'm Adriana Cervantes, extraordinaire at all things life, I guess. Did you like your
extraordinaire
intros?
at jokes?
Yes.
You're really good at jokes.
True statement.
If you're listening to the podcast, he was putting air quotes around that. So it was actually mean and hurtful. Love that. But but I guess let's jump into it because Dusty, I was hoping to have you start the conversation today because honestly, aside from what you just said, I've admired the way that you've engulfed yourself in so many things that you had not experienced before. And I was able to watch you as you were really marked by willingness that was so admirable. And it was a great example for a lot of people who aren't people of color. So the first question that I'd love for you to start answering for us today, and then Jeff, you can after, is what was the first step that you saw for yourself and others that's necessary for joining in on this conversation of race and solidarity?
Well, hey, thank you, first of all, for such a sweet compliment. I'm going to talk later in one of our other questions more about kind of where my wife and I come from and how I think that in some ways set us up in a good way to maybe be a little more proactive, but that'll come later. I want to try to answer the actual question. First step for me, and I think for anyone would be, and the way I'm going to word it is attend to your own humility. So attend, like give attention to your own humility. So I think regardless of race, when you're entering into any conversation that's nuanced and complex and multi-layered, which of course, when we're talking about race, and especially if you are someone that's not a person of color, you need to pay attention to your humility. So let me talk about humility and then apply it. Simply put, humility is a right, a correct estimation of yourself. Like it's self-awareness. So the scriptures say lots about this, but here's just two. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, in humility, consider, and that word consider means value. It's a measurement word. Consider or value other people above yourself. And then Romans chapter 12, verse 3, and to all the SYA folks, we've been talking about Romans 12. It calls us to have a sober judgment of ourselves, a sober estimation, like a right estimation. It's humility. So here are some practical thoughts about working out, or at least towards some more humility regarding race and solidarity. So here's the first one: attend to your humility by assuming some ignorance. And this isn't, I don't think this is mind blowing. I think this is obvious, but when it comes to being Black in America or a person of color in America, I, as a white person, I assume some ignorance about your experience. Again, that shouldn't be mind blowing. That should be so obvious, right? Yeah. But now, so without any false humility, I've done some work, but it's I've done some work in both interpersonal relationships when it comes to this, through conversation, education, but regardless of, and I'm using me as an example, regardless of how educated I've become about American history from a Native American perspective or an African American perspective or an Asian American perspective or a Mexican American perspective or so on, other race perspectives, regardless of how educated I might become, part of humility is I make the obvious assumption that a person of color, from whatever race perspective they've experienced, they know more than me. about that experience, about that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Again, part of me almost deleted all this because I thought this is so obvious, but I think it's a building block acknowledgement, a paying attention to, and it's a part of humility. So I also assume that I've got some blind spots, like I'm ignorant of some things that I don't even know that I'm ignorant of. Obviously, if I'm ignorant, I don't know that I'm ignorant
Yeah.
of that, so I presuppose it, and I think that's important when it comes to having conversations with people that have a different race experience and have a different perspective about lots of things in America. So for any of my fellow white friends, I want, and I can't speak for you, I speak for me. This is not false guilt or white guilt. It's not me sticking my head in the sand or downplaying the extremes of both sides. When I say both sides, I don't mean race or racial sides. Usually it's political thought processes. But I think there's some nuance in anything that's important. So like for me, humility helps me hold in tension falsehoods in lots of extremes. So like I'll be general, right? Because it's easier to speak generally than specifically, because specific can end up getting very confusing. But for me, holding in tensions falsehoods, false ideas from the far political right that would say there is zero systematic racism, right? But then I don't believe that, but I'll hold that in tension with the far extreme left that would say there is extreme systematic racism thriving right now in every single institution. I want to hold those extremes in tension and fight. When I say fight, I don't mean violently. Fight for my own brain and humility to find some nuance and to hear what's going on from perspectives that are different than my own. So humility helps me work towards some of that. Consistently through Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, wisdom is connected to listening, taking advice, and being considerate with your words. So if you want to look up one thing, one chapter of Proverbs, read Proverbs chapter 12. I won't give you the highlights, but it shows that wisdom is more about listening and considering others and being considerate with your words, far more than telling people. So that's my thought on attending to humility. Let me give one more thing, if I can, while I'm rolling here.
Yes.
Because this is a way to pay attention to your humility for all of us. And that is acknowledge your confirmation bias is a reality. Here's confirmation bias. I know we talk a lot about this at SYA. It's the tendency to interpret new or different information as a confirmation of the bias you already have. So like when I get new information, I'm going to have the tendency to want to interpret that new information through the filter of what I already believe, I've already experienced, right? And we all do that. And that's just, so acknowledging that you do it, regardless of your race, is a huge step, I think, in humility that will open your mind and heart up to hear from other perspectives. I've said this before, I've made it a part of my preemptive language, and now it's a habit. I'll say things like, look, this may just be my confirmation bias. I did this in a text just yesterday. So this may be my confirmation bias. And I usually also say, and I could be wrong. But then I'll say, but with that said, here's what I think I believe about that. And I think that's humble, because it, even if you don't mean it in your heart and you just make it a habit, which is what I did when I began saying those things, for me anyway, I'm assuming it's universal. My heart caught up to it. And now when I say I could be wrong, I've been wrong enough to where I really believe that. So confirmation bias is huge. I said the last thing, but this is the last thing on this one, I promise. Attend to your humility by acquiring knowledge beyond your current perspective. So you gotta this is all about learning. So let me talk about my wife and I. We both grew up in a small town in Missouri that was very not diverse. Actually, it was very, very white. And so we experienced, for a good decade of adulthood, we experienced some diverse friendships, but they were mostly through our traveling, speaking at places, building relationships in places far outside of where we were from, and also through mission trips. So with people from other countries. So when we moved to Los Angeles in 2005, like, this was one of the things we were super excited about, right? Just like to live and raise children in a far more diverse location. And no disrespect to where I grew up, right? But we were excited. So this is part of me trying to give a self-aware and honest, humble response to my wife and I's engagement in this conversation for about 15 years since we've lived here. I think part of it was just easier for us to, from jump, right? From every relationship we built here with friends that just don't look like us, I think it was easier for us to just admit our ignorance, because what was the alternative?
Yeah.
No, we've had tons of diverse friendships where we grew up. I mean, what was I going to lie and make stuff up? So I think that actually made it easier in some ways to ask questions and to grow and to just honestly hear and experience and go, wow, I can't even imagine that, right?
Yeah.
And so let me now be honest in a little bit of a more blunt way or harsh way. In recent months that we've been quarantined surrounding injustices specifically toward African Americans, I've heard lots of white friends who've grown up out in Los Angeles that have grown up with diverse friendships who have made statements like, man, I had no idea, or I just didn't know, because recently they've been reading different things, listening to different things. And I'm going to be honest, I've had to work on some judgmentalness, because I've thought, and I've even said it a couple times to people I was close to, like, so did you just never ask your friends of color, like, about their experiences? And did it just never come up? But so my point, though, isn't to bash anybody else. It's honestly to take an honest inventory of my own life and say, maybe it was easier for Amy and I to kind of enter into and admit our own ignorance, to inquire and acquire information. I have too much stuff. So let me end this with this part of the question with this. If you're not a person of color, here's an easy, and you've not engaged in a conversation about race in America in a way where you're listening more to a person of color, if you've not done much of that, especially if you're someone that's been telling, just do this. Just ask a trusted friend who's a person of color. Ask them for permission if they would share their experience of growing up as a Mexican American in America, or as a Black American in America. Ask them their experience. And then just with human listening, then ask, hey, as my friend, what's one book, article, podcast? I mean, because of some friendships I've had for literally more than a decade now, my Kindle lists have been so long, right? The books, and the things I've been reading, and it's part of what's changed how I view the world, not from experience in this skin, but from listening and actually doing some work from things I'm told from trusted friends of color. So humility is the first step.
Yes. Thank you, Jeff. So good. So Jeff, for you, what was the first step that you saw for yourself that was necessary to join this conversation? Because I know your experience was very different.
Yeah. For me, it's tricky, because I feel like I'll probably address a first step for, young adults that are listening, or anyone who's listening, honestly. But for me, a lot of what I'm going to share today is probably going to come more from personal experience, because Dusty just shared, like, he hasn't experienced a lot of these things. But one of the things that Dusty and I have talked about a lot in the past few months is the importance of adjusting your attention. Like, if you haven't decided what the first thing is to do, and if you're at this moment now, as far as we've gotten into this season of race and solidarity, and you still haven't made a first step, then it's probably likely that you need to adjust your attention, because maybe you have been a passerby, and maybe you have kind of maybe avoided some things.
Yeah.
And the sad truth for me is I didn't have the option to adjust my attention. I didn't know I had to adjust my attention until I had to adjust my attention.
Yeah.
And for me, that started the first time I remembered that my attention had to be adjusted when it came to racial differences. For me in my life was I was in elementary school. I was in 4th grade, and I went to Chase Elementary in Panorama City, and my mom picked me up from school every day, and we walked home. And it wasn't until probably a couple weeks in where a friend of mine said, "Hey, who's that white lady that picks you up from school?" And it wasn't offensive, right? He didn't mean anything by it. But for me, even at that age, I was like, why do I, number one, like, why is there a white versus black? Like, why is it, hey, who's that white lady that is picking you up from school? And then it was even more like, is she like your sitter? There was those kind of questions that followed. And at that moment, even at a young age, I was like, I actually have to think about this now. I have to think about the fact that I'm different enough, or my family situation is different enough that has to be addressed, or that has to be even thought about. And then it makes me think about what else are they thinking when I am showing up with my white mom. Yeah. And so that was probably my first encounter where I realized I had to adjust my attention when it came to race, and how I actually see it and see some of the differences in how people see it. And then the other one that I would say is probably more alarming for me, that actually really changed things for me, was when I was 10. And this one lines up more with kind of what we see more in media right now with police. But as a 10-year-old kid, I was driving in a white Ford Taurus with my dad on the weekend, and we were driving on the 170. And as we were exiting the freeway, we got pulled over. And all I remember as a 10-year-old was 2 police officers got out of their cars. And before, there was no questioning. There was no walk up to the window and ask questions or for license or registration. There was literally, all I heard as a 10-year-old kid was I heard guns drawn. Like, I could hear the sound of guns being drawn. And I'm being told as a 10-year-old kid to stick my hands out the window. Like, show me your hands. And I'm like scared out of my mind, because I don't know. I'm like 10 years old trying to figure out what's going on. Right. And I looked at my dad, and he's like, just, stick your hands outside the window, son, kind of thing. Like, he knew what was going on. And I'm just confused and scared. And, again, nothing like we see right now, what's happening to Black people in America, happened in that situation. Could it have? I think so, likely. Right. But nothing happened to that degree, other than what scarred me when it came to how I was treated. Because, and again, in that situation, come to find out later on, my dad had fit the description of someone that they were, looking for. And for me, it was confusing because we were on the freeway. So I didn't understand how you could have fine-tuned your image of what you needed to see while driving, 65 miles an hour on the freeway. And so that was one of my earliest experiences personally when it came to, and I've had more. Again, if I don't know if it's necessary, but if I had more time, I could tell you some of my personal experiences as an adult, because it's happened to me as an adult as well, where I've been pulled over and things have happened to me that I don't think are legal and right. And so for me, I think the short answer, obviously we're talking about adjusting your attention to things. Maybe if you have been a little bit silent and maybe you've been on the sidelines. But I would say this: look in the mirror. And when you look in the mirror, are you a person of color? Are you white? Or are you both, like me, right? Mm-hmm. And then my question is, what are your experiences with all of this? What are your experiences? Have you experienced none of this at all? Or have you experienced some of it as well, or even more? And I would say either way, regardless of which side that you see yourself on when you're looking in the mirror, there's still so much work to be done. Yes. And so the things that Dusty just shared about all these things about humility and how to begin that process is paramount in how we move forward and how we get better as a people, really. I could say as a country, but I just think as humanity, like as humans, we need to be better. And so, that for me, that's what I would probably want to share first. I think adjusting your attention. And like I said, I think, and again, this may sound harsh, but if you are listening to this and you have not done a single thing yet, I think my response to you, if I know you personally, especially, I'm going to say shame on you. Because if you're around people like me and Dusty and Adriana enough, you know how passionate we are about people, number one, but also about helping people and being there and being on the side of justice and mercy. And so I would say we can do better, and so.
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was so good. I think for me, to quickly add to what you both said, I had to withdraw myself. And I think it's important for people to know that that's okay. And I think it has a lot to do with my personality type too. I'm slow to speak naturally. Like Jeff and Dusty know that about me. I need to think things out. So I had to withdraw. And I think that's okay. Like Jesus withdrew constantly in his ministry. If you read the Gospels, like before every great span of like ministry work of healings or miracles, he took time alone to be with the Father. And so I think in our culture that like we're too quick to speak a lot of times. Like there is like so much pressure of like overproduction, like this need to like be the first one on the scene and to be the first one to report on it. And I think that we should value wisdom and waiting and listening just as much as speaking. And like the verse that I really gleaned that from was James 1:19, where he says, "My dear brother and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." And I know that in this conversation, a lot of people are angry. And I want to note that like speaking isn't wrong and anger isn't wrong. James is just cautioning us to be like slow to become those things, rather listen first, because like we're too easily offended when like we need to be, like you guys were saying, let's be humble. Let's assume like I don't know everything and then my experience is different from yours. What can I learn from you? How can I participate in this conversation? I think a lot of that first step is that humble, like, let me withdraw. And not only withdraw like in silence to listen to others, but like God has a lot in his scriptures to say about the children of God as a whole, like the diversity of his church. So get back to that so that you have the truth and the wisdom of God to back your passion. Because I think we're seeing a lot of like passion, but it's like, is there the truth of God behind it? Because that's what's going to revolutionize the world, is Jesus Christ, Amen. So, okay, next question that I have for us today to help us talk through this is for Jeff, if you would like to go first, and then Dusty, you can jump right in. But the fact that this movement is no longer new to us, I think we're seeing a lot of people moving on, I guess you could say, like they're going back to their like regular programming. So do you have advice on how to stay vigilant and like stay participating in the good work that God has for us in this movement and this conversation?
Yeah. I was going to say like, that we're kind of in this season of moving on for people when you have to almost go on social media and somebody has to say like, what the craziest thing about the red table with Will and Jada is? The fact that they still haven't arrested the man that killed Breonna Taylor. Like they have to use other current stories to remind you of things that we are still working on, that we want to fix and see changed. So that is a very like clear sign that there is people who have moved on. And one of the things I thought about when I was thinking about this question, you may have seen, if you're listening or you're watching, you may have seen this in sports. Sorry, Adri. In sports, whenever it's a big game, right? The big game, or maybe the championship is on the line. I always observe the losing team as much as I do the winning team. And if you do, you usually see one of two types of players, right? You have the players that instantly kind of retreat, head to the locker room, sometimes crying, right? And then there's some of the ones who actually sit out there either on the court or on the field and they watch the winning team celebrate.
Yeah.
And when I thought about that, the one that I remember a lot of and that I've even read about, the Lakers lost to the Celtics in the 2008 NBA Finals. And it was heartbreaking because they lost by 39 points. Like, it wasn't even like, let's make this a close game and see what happens. They lost really badly, like 39 points. And Kobe Bryant considered that moment. He even said this. He was quoted saying that was the most important piece in the second half of his 20-year NBA career. And a lot of that is because he used that moment frequently to come back to the reminder that he didn't want to lose that again. Like that again. He didn't want to lose like that again. He didn't want to experience that again. He wanted to change that outcome. And so I think my advice for this season of like maybe forgetfulness or moving on, my advice is to go back. Go back to the moment that all these race issues became real for you. Like, what is the moment that you sat there silent because you couldn't believe what you saw? For me, it's the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that I watched one man put his knee on the neck of another man and took his life. It's the white tee on Ahmaud Arbery as he's jogging down the street. I can't unsee those images. And so for a second, if I feel like I'm losing my grasp on that, I sometimes can go back to those images because it's gonna be painful in a way, but also is gonna keep me focused on the fact that I still want to see things change.
Yeah.
This made me think about Micah 6:8, this question also, because it says the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you, to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And so after like reading that verse this week, in light of all that we're talking about here today, I asked myself, why should I stop loving justice? Why should I stop doing what is right? Why should I stop if videos of police brutality and videos of racism hasn't stopped?
Yeah.
Why should we stop trying to change if nothing has changed? Or at least not enough has changed? Why should we stop? One of the big ways that I stay in this and how I stay participatory in all this, I follow the leaders. And so I would encourage you guys to follow the leader. Like, who are the people that you see that are leaders in this and what's going on? And so I continue to pay attention to those voices and those leaders that I trust, that I know haven't lost that fire, that haven't moved on. They have that spiritual fervor, right? Like,
yeah,
people like Sean King, if you guys are looking for people to talk to, follow and listen to, a huge voice in what's going on right now. And then, or if it's like friends, personal friends, like a good friend of Dusty and mine is Phil Allen. And he's someone that, has kind of had this fire in his belly about this for his whole life, really. And so
yeah,
he's somebody that I frequent, go to and see and listen and hear what he's doing because he's leading the charge in ways that I can't, but also teaching me ways that I can as well, if that makes sense. And so my advice would be to go back, number one, to those moments that you felt most impacted by everything that's going on. And the second is to follow the leaders that are around you.
Yeah. So good. Thank you. And Dusty, what about for you? What is your advice for how people can stay in this like conversation and in this movement?
Well, this is probably dangerous, but after listening to both of you, I'm thinking of, I'll share what I wrote because this is the shortest one, but I think like finding the balance or a hybrid of what you both talked about, like of like what Jeff talked about in terms of like being intentional to stay in this, because first of all, this is probably assumed, it's why we haven't like specifically said it, but let me say it for everybody. Like for anybody that might be, especially someone who's not Black or a person of color, for the temptation to think, oh man, but like there's lots of problems in the world, right? Like there's many things that we could engage in, right? Let me speak the thing that probably should just be assumed. Slavery is our national sin, right? And even though we've progressed and done so many things that, sure, let's celebrate them, but like the fact that they were like evil things and then slowly progressed, like it is still the under the rooting of a sin and problem. And so we are Americans. And so that's why we stay vigilant. And as the church, though, in speaking in responding to what the scripture that Jeff shared from Micah, of God's heart all throughout the scriptures for justice. And so, but then I'm thinking about what Adri said, what you said, Adri, about withdrawing to like, to have perspective, to have the Lord speak to your heart, the scriptures speak to your heart. I think the way you stay involved, honestly, is to do those two things. Because as I was thinking, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a wannabe psychologist. And I'm thinking about I'm thinking about some of you, not you two. I'm thinking about some of my friends at SYA. There are so many of you that have engaged so deeply in the movement of what's going on against racism and some realities that have been around for a long, long time. So when I've counseled some of you, one of the things I've realized is that you need to do what Adri did and does as a natural personality, because for some of you, the cause, and I'm going to do the cause only because there's probably something deeper that you need to readjust your attention as a callback. The cause specifically of racial racial inequality has somehow distracted you in doing some things in you. And so because regardless of your race, you can't do much good of anything for the world or against bad things in the world if you haven't done the work in you, right? Character's everything. And so I feel like the hybrid of those two things, of staying vigilant and involved, but withdrawing. And here's how I said it in my little preparation, was to avoid avoidance. And Adri spoke to this basically of people that have kind of moved on, right? And I got to tell you that I think that's a big temptation for people who are not a person of color. And not even like an evil temptation. It's like a human preservation. Oh my gosh, this is really difficult. And it's heartbreaking. For people that haven't listened to a black friend, especially a black man, when we're talking about police brutality, if you haven't listened to stories like Jeff from your friends and you begin to do that, not only will it hurt your soul and heart and make you uncomfortable and cause you to lose sleep, it should. And that's okay. And so then when the temptation to avoid that, what you need to do is avoid avoidance. Here's something that I've observed in these last few months, and maybe this will speak to you if you're listening, if you've struggled with this. So I've noticed that in our national conversation, because this is what we're talking about as a nation, as we should be, right? When a person of color shares a lived experience similar to what Jeff shared, but there's multitudes of those experiences, some that also have to do with policemen, some that also have to do with being a child and a friend says something, and everything in between, right? When I've observed that when someone shares a lived experience of any kind of injustice or racism, often, and I mean, I've observed this not just on social media, but in some conversations, there's often this knee-jerk reply of something like, yeah, racism is terrible, but I don't agree with rioting. Or what happened to George Floyd was terrible, evil. But listen, I'm not privileged. And then I've actually heard people tell about how they're not privileged, right? And then, or something like, yeah, but our country's come so far. Why is everything about race? I think if we're honest and humble, then we can admit that the yeah, but statements probably say more about our human desire to avoid difficult, nuanced, heartbreaking, complex, generational issues that are painful. And especially if you've never experienced any of that, I have not, then there's a temptation to just be like, I want to avoid it. And here's the last thing I'll say on this, because we're Christians. And so let me speak to a temptation that religious folks have. To say things like, look, there's only one race. It's the human race. Jesus died for all lives. Okay, sure. But why? My question has been to some friends, why is that the reflex reaction to someone sharing their lived experience instead of something like, wow, I've never experienced anything like that. Like, and again, especially if you're white and you've not listened to some stories and just listened, and then, and maybe you're not an emotional person, so maybe you won't cry, but to like, just do the like empathy thing, like, the Jesus thing, like, love people the way you want others to love you. Like, what would that be like if that were me? What would that be like if my 16-year-old son had his license and was out driving and experienced some things that happen and have happened in our country for, well, a long, 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 long time. So whether you're red, yellow, black, brown, white, guard yourself against oversimplifying things. Guard yourself against, especially against using scriptures and Christian cliche to basically avoid a really difficult but important conversation. There's a temptation for us to make true statements with the goal of avoiding these difficulties. You're going to notice other people do that before you notice it in yourself. And that's why just acknowledging, I've got a confirmation bias. I take care of myself better than I take care of other people. I give myself benefit of the doubt better than I give you the benefit of the doubt. So this takes humility, but it also takes, like what Jeff talked about, it takes this like intentionality to not avoid, but also take care of your soul. I'm pointing at Adri on my screen. Take care of your soul. Withdraw when you need to get perspective.
Yeah. I mean, and to add to that, there's, just so you guys know too, there's no disagreement between Adri and myself. Like, as far as you're maybe listening and thinking there's this tension between like get involved, but also like retreat when you need to. I do both of those things, like, just so you guys know. And like, I think one of the other huge things I'll say to young adults is, especially young adults that have younger siblings, younger cousins, younger people around you, and you're already young, but you are teaching everyone that's watching you that's younger than you, you're teaching them how to respond to this moment. And so it's actually good if you have moments of retreat and you're processing, right? Like, Jesus didn't retreat because he was avoiding, because he was scared, or he didn't like, he was retreating for a purpose. It was to be with the Father. It was to be with himself.
That's good. Right.
And Adri does the same thing for herself because she knows herself. And again, retreating for me, I have to, so I'm just going to let you guys know, I'm going to break it down. I don't go on social media if I'm around my son. I don't right now. Because if I'm, my son is 3 years old, and even at 3.5 years old, he knows when something's wrong in my spirit. He can feel it. And so I know how I get, the tendency of how I get when I see a video that I should not see around my son. And so now I retreat from social media. Like, we can retreat physically away from people, but we can retreat from social media as well. And so I do that as much as I can. And I wait till I know that I'm safe. Maybe I'm with my wife, or maybe I'm by myself. And that's safe for me to actually dive into some of these issues. So.
Man. That's so good.
Yeah. And I think, like, for myself, I would say, like, I know it sounds weird, but I feel awake to the issue of racism. And it's not as if I didn't think it happened, because just in case if you didn't know, Adriana Lisette Cervantes, I'm a Mexican woman born of immigrants. So I have experienced the feeling of like other in my life. Like, I've never experienced overt racism personally, but I did experience like the feeling, like the results of systemic racism growing up. Like, I didn't know that's what they were at the time. I always felt different. Although I was accepted, I wasn't the same. And I was aware, like, even as a little girl, which is crazy to think, like, I was aware that in order to be successful, I needed to adapt to, like, whiteness. And it was as small as not seeing my culture celebrated outside of my own family and other Latinos. And, like, that's why watching Coco with my family, like, when it just came out, it made us all cry.
Mhm.
Because as an adult, I had the feeling watching that movie, like, that family looks just like mine. Like, but it was for the first time. So it was a very, like beautiful, but realizing, oh, I'd never seen that before. And then I've experienced, like, things as traumatic as, like, seeing the trauma of my own people, like, who look like me, which is what a lot of Black people are experiencing, on and on and on. But especially now, everything they're seeing on social media, like a few years ago with everything that was happening with the border and deportation, how that was constantly on the news. And I remember specifically this one news like segment that, like, just changed me. It was a Mexican man who was beat to the brink of death by white supremacists because of things that they had heard from politicians. And after hearing, like, that story of, like, people after people saying, like, you should go back to your homeland, like, a different feeling grips you in those moments. And, like, I've been listening to a lot of different people talk about, like, vicarious trauma is, like, you're seeing somebody who looks like you or who represents you going through something traumatic.
Yep.
And so when I say, like, I feel awake to racism, it doesn't mean, like, I wasn't aware of it. It's just, like, sometimes when you even experience small versions of it, like, you push it down in order to survive. Like, even though I've carried those feelings growing up, like a backpack of burden, like, but I didn't want to focus on it because I needed to be, successful, American dream. Like,
Mhm.
but now seeing, like, the Black community rise up and say, no more, like, it reminded me of my inherent worth, like, as a Mexican in America. And I didn't see, like, standing with them as not standing for myself or my community, like, because we're all the body of Christ. So when we all win, we all win. Like,
Yeah.
So my encouragement to you guys, just like Dusty and Jeff said, is, like, stay in the conversation, even when it's hard, even for people who are not Black. Like, but you've experienced your own things, like what the Black community has experienced. It doesn't negate your experience, and you can, like, support them just as much as you're supporting your own people. Like, we all need to stand together and say, this is wrong across the board.
Yeah. Heard that.
Hey, let me add to something, because I think like those perspectives are so good for someone who's never experienced that. Like they don't. I mean, like someone like me, to find family that wasn't born in America, right, is way back. You're right, and that's and not all white people have that exact thing. Some people, their parents, came from a European country or whatever. But like, because I think that a big part of within the national conversation, some of the conflict, and again, I could be wrong, and I really don't know what I'm talking about on all things. So I'm sure I'm missing some things, but I think some of it is just simply a defensiveness of people that look like me, that are outside of those experiences that you guys are talking about. And then this defensiveness that neither of you said, I want to point out for anybody that may, because I'm presupposing something here, that there may be some defensiveness, even though neither of you said, because you white people or whatever. And so here's the thing I want to add to fellow white friends who are trying to learn and grow and listen and hear. And so I think one of the temptations we fight against is moral licensing. I think all people fight against that. But I want to be specific about this. And it's moral licensing is simply the idea that when you've done something morally good, you're going to be more tempted to, in that same thing, be morally bad, because you'll justify yourself. And so here's, in this issue, this blew me away. This was years ago. I read this from Malcolm Gladwell, a Stanford study that revealed a large group that they surveyed of non-African American people who voted for Barack Obama. They were actually far more likely to say racist things than they ever were before in their life after they voted on Obama. Now, you may not be able to relate to that, whatever your race is. So here's one you can, right? When you've done like a really long, difficult workout and you justify to yourself, I'm going to have a candy bar because I worked out really hard and I burned extra calories, right? That's not evil, by the way.
Guilty.
But it's an example. Yeah, me too. It's an example of moral licensing. And then I'll shut up here, Adrian, you can get us back on track. But social media is it's a temptation for all of us that magnifies so many of these social instincts that we have, because social media is going to cause you and me, specifically those of you that look like me, to want to justify and even sometimes like signal using our social media, like, hey, I'm not a bad guy. I'm not a bad girl. Hey, look at this. And while, again, social media should be used for the good, all of us, regardless of race, you've got to guard your heart toward like simple moral licensing, like basically making sure everybody knows what side you're on, which isn't a bad thing. But if the heart reason is to say, hey, look what I've done, I'm good, I'm fine, all of a sudden, like Jeff talked about, adjusting your attention, you've adjusted it the wrong way. You've looked away from yourself, and you've basically made sure everybody knows, hey, look at me. Virtue signaling, I think, is the trendy phrase for this, right? So guard that, because whatever, and note, something Adri talks a lot about, like just in anxiety, like note I'm speaking to my fellow white brothers and sisters. Note when you're having these conversations and you feel defensive. First of all, give grace to yourself. But note it and like express it at least to yourself and God, if nowhere else. Okay, sorry, I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but you both inspired that thought.
No, thank you, Des.
Get out of racism free cards. Is what we call them.
Right, that's good.
Okay, so last question, and Dust, if we could start with you on this one. It's the perfect question, I think, for us to close this conversation. Doesn't mean the conversation's over, but just for now. The last question is basically, how is this work that we're doing now gospel? Like, how is this literally the job of the church?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the great example is Jesus, and not only his life, but his stories and stories like the Good Samaritan. Like, you can't, or because, any story with a Samaritan in it, that is the stereotypical black-white. I mean, none of them were white back in Jesus's people and the Samaritans, but in terms of an illustration. So all those stories, John chapter 4, when Jesus meets with the woman at the well, I mean, this is like before they were using the word gospel for the mission of Jesus. This was Jesus living this.
Yes.
But what I want to use to close with, I want to use that as a preface, because like you can't, it's always Jesus. But I'm going to actually use something Paul said to make my point before I turn it over to one of you. But we are called in the kingdom to ache with those who ache. The way Paul says it, Romans chapter 12, verse 15, mourn with those who mourn. And I think you make this a prayer, that regardless of your race, that you would ask God, I want to feel deeply for injustice the way you do. And the good news is, as we've already implied, you don't have to go far in the scriptures to get God's heart about injustice and what he wants his people to be involved in. But But Romans chapter 8, verse 26 says, in talking about praying to feel these feelings that God wants for us, the Spirit of God helps us in our frailty. We don't know what we ought to pray, but the Spirit intercedes for us. It might mean, like, this is the last thing we're talking about, but it's really probably the essential thing. But I think there's some work to get there for most of us just as human beings. But when you sit down and listen to a friend, a coworker, someone you have human connection with, and they look different than you, or they've grown up very different than you, and you begin to listen to some, whether it's racism stories in their life, injustices, poverty, when they're talking about systemic things, and maybe you don't want to buy that, but you're listening to their stories. And let me point something out, by the way, just because I think this is actually key. Just because someone has experienced racism or oppression or suffering, it doesn't mean their opinion about all things are correct or right. But listen, it does mean that their perspective is essential to be heard. And again, man, I'm privileged in a lot of ways. One of them was like the dad I grew up with. Here's a quick kind of funny story. There was a band, well, most of you know, because you know the story or the movie Straight Outta Compton, but there was a band, NWA, that was super big and controversial in the late 80s. And I was watching Yo MTV Raps. I never missed it as a middle school kid. It was my introduction into the world of hip hop, really. And but I was watching this news show about NWA, and they were being kicked out. They had a song that was very derogatory and explicit toward the police. Let's put it that way. And they were getting kicked out of arenas and whatever. I was watching the story. My dad came in, and he's standing. My dad grew up in the same town I grew up in. And he's standing in the door, and he's watching, and I'm waiting to see what he says. And when he's done, when the story's done, he says, "Man, Dust, I don't like the language they use toward the police." And then he turned to leave, but then he stopped, came back, and he says to me, and I remember this, like, because I was so like, what's he gonna say about this? Really, I wasn't really thinking racial things at all. I was just thinking they're saying all these bad words, and I was a young punk, so I was like, yeah. And my dad turns to me and he says, "But Dust, Black people have experienced some injustice and oppression that you and I will never experience." And he paused, and he said, "So I think those young men's perspective needs to be heard." But then he goes, "But I don't like their language." And then he turned around and walked off. And so that's the kind of stuff I got from like way young. And this, because my dad and mom modeled like this human assumption that people have experienced things that I haven't. That's just human, right? So then when you add that to race, and you're already thinking in this way of when someone's hurting and when a whole community is crying out, the people of God are called, we're commanded to ache with them. So here's the last thing, because I think this is super interesting, and I know our SYA folks will dig this if they've never heard about it. It's a powerful practice in Judaism to this very day that has its roots in scripture. It's called sitting, like to sit, and then it's a Hebrew word, Shiva. And I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but Shiva is basically the Hebrew for the number 7. The idea is when someone died, if Adriana is a part of my community in Jewish life, and her mother died, Jeff and I, as part of her Jewish community, if we were all Jewish, we would go to her home with other friends and families, and we would sit. We wouldn't necessarily stay all night. Some people would, but for at least 7 days, we would sit with her. And there's all kinds of stuff written about this in ancient life in Judaism, but also present day. But there was this understanding that I'll make it. Sorry, Adrian, I know this is terrible to think about. Your mom's not going to pass away for a long, long time. But in the example, there would be this understanding from Jeff and I that Adrian's going to go through an early experience of anger, of frustration, of denial, of shock, and as a community within this Jewish idea of sitting Shiva, we're not going to try to get her to bypass that. We're going to allow that, and we're going to cry with her. That's why when Jesus would show up to a person's house and the little girl had died, all these people outside, crying and wailing, because this was part of the tradition. And so 7 days, but it would there was an understanding that most likely Adri is going to also, in these 7 days and beyond, but specifically 7, have these beautiful moments and stories and memories of joy about her mom.
Yeah.
And we're going to enter into that too. So there's the background. Here's how I want to close my thoughts on last steps. 7 days. Also, 7 is in the Bible a symbolism for completion. What if I just want to be specific about Black lives right now. What if the non-Black Christian community were just started with this idea that we're going to, whatever you want to call it, that we're going to sit with our brothers and sisters, and there's for sure going to be some anger, right? Some of it righteous, some of it not. But it's going to be expressed because this is what human people do when we mourn, right? There's going to be all denial and frustration. I've had conversations with really good friends that are not white, that have been walking and pacing with me for years, that we were talking, and they just got really frustrated. This was several months ago. And I just listened, even cried. And then this one specific brother of mine said, Dust, I'm sorry. That has nothing to do with you, man. And I'm like, dude, it's okay. Like, I don't understand. Like, I've not lived through what this like vicarious trauma. I've not experienced that with what's going on. Like, what if the Christian community just started there, the non-Black Christian community? What if we said, we're going to sit with, and we're going to allow, and listen, none of the extreme stuff either. You know very well, logically, I'm not talking about, let's be cool with whatever extreme things you want to, no, of course, I'm talking about with human people that we know, right?
Yeah.
Like sitting with, but also allowed the Black community to go back and forth from anger, denial, frustration, rage, and joy, right? I've listened to, Jeff and I have been friends for a long time, right? Like and Jeff and I have talked, and I'm not trying to expose things we've talked about. None of it's bad, but but I want to share this for y'all listening in or watching. Like, Jeff has gone through all of those emotions as a Black man, and I've got to be around him several times when he needed to do that, and it was anger and frustration, and like gritting your teeth, but also Jeff's had joy. Right? Like, and we've talked about things. Like, I had a conversation before we started this, someone asking me what's the worst thing on this issue that I've read lately and what's the best. And I'm like, well, the best, I've been going back and looking at some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest works, and some of them that I've never read. And like, it's just like filling me up. Not only is he a modern day prophet, but there's like a reason for that within the content, right? And the joy and when we sit with people who are mourning, it should be understood that it's all going to be there, and it ebbs and flows. Yeah. And so for those of us that are not Black, what if we started there? And I think if we can get to that human place, that's when we're going to actually have some legs under us to really, really actually make some systemic change and work toward justice.
Yeah. Thanks. So good. So Jeff, what about for you? How is this the job of the church? How are we all included in this?
Yeah, it was funny about it. Maybe it's not funny. I think there's a striking irony that we, for who knows how long and how many times we've all said it, but like, the church is not a building. We're not confined to the four walls. We're meant to do things out. And a lot of us haven't been in the building for a while now because of what's going on with COVID.
Right.
And so there's all the reason we need to be out there and doing something about things that are going on, right? I'm not telling you guys to go hang out and do a bunch of things and without a mask and all that. Be safe. One of the things that I thought about with this whole area of these questions, and just with this topic in particular, because it is very important for us as a church, again, I don't remember who said it, but I remember hearing it and I kind of latched onto this saying, but basically someone said, you can't heal what you won't touch, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't heal what you won't touch. And I remember instantly thinking about the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Jesus tells this story about the Good Samaritan. The man is left for dead on the side of the road, right? And if you know that story, and I think a lot of us listening and watching do know that story, my question for you is, in this situation, as a church and as someone that knows what's going on, have you been the priest or the Levite? Like, have you been the person who just passes
Mm-hmm.
by, avoiding those who are hurting? See, for me in this story, it's not just the way that the Good Samaritan helps this near dead Jewish traveler. When Jesus tells this story, basically Jews and Samaritans despise each other. Like, they couldn't be more different and avoiding of each other, right? But the Samaritan sees his neighbor. He sees a Imago Dei, right? Someone who's made in the image of God. That's all he sees. He doesn't see differences or reasons to despise. None of that stuff mattered to him, because the Father, he's in the business of restoration and helping those who are hurting, period. That is what he does. And every single day, the Father is looking for laborers to join in that work. And that's where we come in, right? Where we get to join in that work. And so I can't get over how much that story reminds me of what we need to be doing as a church. And again, it's as simple as the fact that it comes from a story that Jesus told, right? And so we always want to bring it back to Jesus, where here's your Jesus coming back to Jesus' story to get some direction. And the last thing I'll share is, I said it earlier, but I have a 3-year-old son. If you don't know that, you probably haven't been around me much or follow me on social media, because that's all you ever see me post about. I have a 3-year-old son. His name is Nolan. He's a wild boy. He's a little bit wild. And Dusty, you got boys, and you know what I'm talking about when I say this. But sometimes when you're hanging out with the boys, or you're watching the boys, or I'm watching Nolan, sometimes you can leave them for like 5 seconds, and somehow within that 5-second window, somehow they hurt themselves. And often, so this will happen. And when Nolan often hurts himself, I usually come up and I run to the aid of my son who's crying. And I usually have to tell him, I say, son, talk to me. Tell me what's wrong. And then I always say, I can't help you if you don't tell me what hurts. When he's saying I hurt myself, I can't. I tell him every time, I say, Nolan, I can't help you, son, if you don't tell me what hurts. And so if you're watching right now, if you're listening, please, I'm asking you, please watch and listen for those who are hurting.
Yes.
Ask them to tell you what's hurting. Ask them that. And then do whatever you can to help. That's my advice.
Yeah, it just, like, everything you guys said, and going back to like what Dusty said, it makes me think of like a life verse for me since high school. Ephesians 4:1, Paul is urging us to live a life worthy of the gospel. And like other versions say, worthy of the calling that you've received. And I just feel like if there's a question about like, what is the church's role in this? Like, this is the calling that we've received. Like, this is the gospel of Jesus. He came to, when back in Luke 4, when he quotes Isaiah and he's like, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to do what? Proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Like, that's Jesus. That is gospel. And like, it's not just for us to go to church on Sundays and to not cuss, which those things aren't bad. Like, I'm not trying to make light of those things.
Yeah.
But like, there is so much more.
Yep.
There is so much gospel that we have an opportunity, and we've been called to be a part of, that proclaims freedom for the prisoners, good news for the poor, recovery of sight for the blind, and the year of the Lord's favor. Like, I would hope that all of the children of God would experience the year of the Lord's favor. like equally. That's the prayer of the church. So yes, guys, we should want to welcome as many sheep into the fold, like of our good shepherd. We should want that. And so I hope that you guys would just take one thing. Like, I know that sometimes conversations like this can be overwhelming. And if you are feeling overwhelmed, which I know a lot of us have, let's be honest, during this time, it's overwhelming. A situation of injustice that is this huge and ongoing for so many years is overwhelming. It should be overwhelming. And if you're in that place where you're feeling overwhelmed, we want to encourage you as a ministry, just take one thing. Like one thing that maybe Dusty said or Jeff said or I said that spoke to you, and just start there. Like, this is the beginning of a journey for all of us. So the Lord has opened the eyes of, it seems like, the world.
Yeah.
And praise God that he did, because we don't want to be asleep anymore to this. We want to be awake. And so just start there. This is the beginning of a conversation. And as a community, I know I'm not just talking for myself, we want to be a part of this conversation continually. And so even though this, podcast or video, however you're viewing or listening to this, even though it may be ending now, it's just the beginning. We're all invited to be part of this together by Jesus. Like, it's pretty amazing that he includes us in this. So we love you guys, and we'll talk to you soon more about this. And we will see you on the next SideCast.
Peace out, everybody. Love you all.
Bye, friends.